And again this morning, we are going to look at Numbers chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11. Again, good morning. I'm glad you're here. And I'm glad I'm here. And the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned out among them, consumed some outlying parts of the camp. And then the people cried out to Moses. And Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the place of the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing, and the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our strength is dried up, and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at." Now manna was like coriander seed, and its appearance was like bdellium. And the people went about and gathered it on and ground it in hand mills, or beat it in mortars, and baked it or boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. And the dew fell upon the camp in the night, and the manna fell with it. Let's pray. Father, in these next minutes, open our ears to your word. We come to you with the word of power. Your word will accomplish its purpose. Father, allow me to be a proper messenger of your word. Open our ears, Father, to hear what you have to say to us today. Teach us. In the name of Jesus, we ask this. Amen. You know, there are times during the day that my heart will spontaneously cause my mouth to speak praise to God. I remember something he's done, and I want to thank him for his goodness. And I think of my salvation and what a great salvation it is. And I speak thanksgiving to God. But there's another side of me. That's my spirit speaking to me. But you know, my flesh talks to me also. My flesh is that part of me that seeks to be independent from God. It was the way that I used to live before I became regenerate, before I got that new nature. It's not a sinful nature, even though the NIV mistranslates it, you know, those who live according to the sinful nature cannot please God. The word is flesh. And flesh is simply a principle that lives in me that seeks to be independent from God. And we can't get into that now. If I stick around long enough for us to get into Romans, we'll deal with that then. But my flesh, I found out, I've got a lot of different types of flesh. But one of the flesh patterns that I have is I have complaining flesh. And yet this passage teaches us is one of the things that draws God's anger is ingratitude. We're coming on Thanksgiving this week. Although a lot of people don't call it Thanksgiving anymore, it's Turkey Day or Football Day or something like that, because Thanksgiving implies that there is somebody to say thanks to. And we don't like to admit that we're dependent on the benevolent hand of God to provide for us. Like I said, ingratitude is one of the things that brings God's anger. Doesn't it irritate you? Haven't you done something for someone and they've walked off and you feel like saying, "You're welcome"? But part of ingratitude is manifested by complaining. You know, I heard a story once about an unusual farmer. This farmer was a complainer. Now, most farmers aren't complainers, right? But this farmer complained a lot. It was too wet, it was too dry, it was too hot, it was too cold, prices were too low, and if the price was great, he didn't get the kind of yield that he thought he deserved. One year, his area of the country had an amazing year. The temperature was like it was controlled by a thermostat. The rains came at just the exact time they were needed and the exact amount of moisture. The prices were the best that they had been for years, and everybody had a bumper crop. And the pastor was excited to talk to his friend, because he knew that after a year like this, he would have to admit that he had indeed been blessed by God. And so he happened to run into him in the coffee shop, and he looked at him and said, "Quite a year, huh?" And the farmer kind of mumbled, "Yeah, but it was awful hard on the ground." I want to talk about ingratitude today, and a lot of this comes from my early years. I did a good job at gathering material, but not noting where it came from. And so I can't give proper credit to this, but a lot of it is borrowed. And we're going to learn about how God views ingratitude. It says, first of all, we see the Exodus happening, right? The people called out to God. They said, "Deliver us." And God did. And you know, it's interesting, Exodus 38 or 39, 38 I think, tells us that when the people went out, there were other people that went out with them. And so there were more than just God's children in that Exodus. There were probably slaves from Egypt that saw this as their chance to escape as well. And it's indicative of the promise of Genesis 12, when God told Abraham that the whole world would be blessed through him, that these people would share in the blessings that had been given to Israel. Now, they became a thorn in Israel's side, and a little later on here in verse 4, they're called the rabble began to complain. And haven't you noticed that complaining is contagious? When one person starts to complain, a lot of other people pick it up and begin to complain as well. But what did they have to complain about? God had delivered them. They had seen God deliver them. He parted the sea. They walked across. They saw God provide water when the water was bitter. It was made sweet. They were given quail and water from the rock. They saw God's hand work as they were delivered. Now, they have left the wilderness of Sinai. They camped at Sinai for about 2 years. And now they're ready to go on their trek toward the promised land. By the way, A little mnemonic if you want to remember when Israel left Sinai and began to journey toward the promised land. It's Numbers 10, 11, and 12. So if somebody comes up to you, do you know when Israel left Sinai? I say, well, yeah, it was Numbers 10, 11, and 12. And here they have left, and they're only a few days out, and the rabble begins complaining. This group of people that were hangers-on, seeking probably what they saw the power of God when he delivered the Israelites, they began to complain because they didn't have meat. And the Israelites picked it up as well. You know, many years ago, some very dear friends gave us a book of children's rhymes. And it was called a Pillar of Pepper. I think it's called A Child's Book of Bible Rhymes now or something like that. But if you want a great gift for your grands or your greats, if you can find that on the internet still, I don't think it's in print, but I think it's available. But it's little poems that teach them principles of Scripture. The title actually comes from a poem in there that says, when Mrs. Lot sinned and was clearly at fault, God changed her into a pillar of salt. But when Miriam sinned, she became a poor leper instead of something like a pillar of pepper. Since sinning can change us in ways you can see, I plan to be good so that you'll recognize me. But recognize also that I will obey because Jesus, my Savior, wants it that way. But the little poem that talks about this particular instance said, asked a grumbling child named Hannah, can I have an orange or a banana? I've had just enough of this fluffy white stuff. It's boring to eat only manna. Then to Hannah, her mom did declare, perceive how our cupboard is bare. While the desert we wander, of this food get fonder, because manna tastes better than air. But they couldn't catch that principle. They were ungrateful that God provided for them every day. Day after day after day, 6 days a week, God provided food for them. Now, on the sixth day, they were able to gather for 2 days to have a Sabbath rest. But on the other days, they were only to gather enough for 1 day to remind them that God is their provider and he will take care of their needs. Now, I haven't spent a lot of time in the desert, and so maybe it isn't as odd if you spent time in the desert here as it was for me when I went to Israel and was in the wilderness around the Dead Sea. I never understood wilderness until I was there, and all there was rock. Everywhere you looked, and maybe some scrubbed piece of brush sticking out. You didn't see any life, no nothing. And that's what the wilderness of Sinai was like. It was very different than the fertile Nile Valley where they had lived as slaves. The Israelites were on this trip and they worried, how are we going to survive? We are in this desolate area. How will we be provided for? The logistics of feeding 600,000 men plus everyone else that was there were incredible. But God handled the situation. He invented a new food, or provided a food they weren't aware of, called manna. Actually, it's the Hebrew word manna, which is a combination of what and it. What is it? So I call it what's it. But each morning, a fine flake fell with the dew, and the residue was something that people were able to eat. It provided all their daily needs, but it wasn't meat. Now, I love a good steak about as much as anybody. And so I might have been one of those to complain that all I had was a wafer to eat every day. But they forgot there's former slavery, and they said, oh, if we could go back to Egypt and live as slaves, we could have all this. Remember, the fish was free. And the food was great. We had cucumbers, and we had melons, and we had onions, and we had garlic. And they were willing to trade their freedom for food. It says Moses heard the people of every family wailing, each at the entrance of his tent. And the Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. And to show you that complaining is contagious, Moses started complaining to God. I didn't ask for this job. I didn't bear these people. Now I'm stuck to listening to them 24/7, day and night, day after day, week after week. These people complain. Where am I going to get meat for all these people? And the Lord said, or didn't say, but he could have said, do you remember when you got water out of a rock? Now, when we think of that miracle, we think of our Sunday school papers with a little dribbling out from a rock, you know. One of my mentors in Old Testament was preaching somewhere, and the guy from the city department of water happened to be in the audience, and he came back to them the next night and said, you know, I started figuring that for enough water for that many people and that much livestock, it had to be a torrent gusher. I'd probably compare it to the fountain over in Fountain. You know, that much water coming up and providing for the people. I provided water for you out of a rock of all things. Remember you had quail? And Moses said, but where am I going to get meat for these people? And God said, you know, I'm going to provide. But you know what? I'm going to let you eat meat. But you're going to have so much meat that it's going to start coming out of your nostrils, and you'll be sick of it. And it says he brought quail in from the sea. And people went out and gathered. It said nobody gathered less than 10 homers. That means that everybody had gathered about 60 bushels of meat. So God said, you're not going to just eat it for a day or 2 days or 10 or 20. You're going to eat it for a month. And it said while the meat was still in their teeth, God's anger broke about them, and a lot of people were struck dead by a plague. And they were buried there, and it says that they were buried, they called the place Kibroth Hatava, which means the graves of greed. And so they recognized that they had erred in sinning against God by their complaining. Like I said, how could they have done this? They had seen this firsthand. They had seen God provide in instance after instance after instance. These chosen people questioned if God cared about them. They question, did God know what we're going through? Did God have the ability to do anything about it? What if God would have said, okay, I'll let you go back to Egypt. I'll let you be a slave again. They'd have been slaves. They'd have suffered infanticide more and more. And they probably would have passed into the annals of a forgotten people only known by archaeologists. What a terrible fate to give up being the progenitors of the Messiah, the Hebrew kingdom, all for a ham sandwich. Well, I guess you can't say ham sandwich. Quail meat. How different are we from that? I complain so often. You haven't given me this. You haven't given me that. Do you know what my circumstance is? God, do you know my needs? God, can you do anything about it? How many prayers are you thankful for that God didn't answer? Think about that. If God had answered some of my prayers, Cindy wouldn't be sitting back there today. It'd be somebody else. Fortunately, I met her later. I might be in a different profession. How about you? What would have happened to you had God answered some of the prayers that you prayed because you were complaining? You know, Romans gives a picture of a life that's governed by your own decisions and complaints. Romans 1:28 says, furthermore, since they did not know or think it worthwhile to attain knowledge of God, He gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. They've become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, and ruthless. Again, had God granted their request, had God listened to their complaining, they would have missed out on His best for them. Like I said, no promised land, no great and glorious Hebrew kingdom, no future Messiah, no central place in the history of the world. Just think, and we see it today even, don't we? This entire world revolves around that little speck of ground that we call Israel. Are leeks and garlic worth that much? What is it that's worth stepping out of God's will? Are we really willing to forfeit what God has planned for us? God, who knows my situation and me better than anyone else? Do we think of what we would forfeit if our complaints were answered? God's promised to provide for us. And while dwelling in this present world, the wilderness that we're in, we have the peace of God. We have the certainty of salvation. We have joy. And we know that we're going to be changed into the likeness of our Savior. We'll see our Heavenly Father face to face. And we'll be at a place where there's no more fear, no more death, and every tear will be wiped from our eyes. There will be no more mourning or crying or pain, because as it says in Revelation, the first things have passed away. That's a partial picture of what we would be missing if our complaints were answered that God isn't giving me a fair deal. Would you really give up heaven for a sandwich? Does that seem like a fair trade? Would you give up your salvation in order to have the pleasure of a little sin? You know, I printed up some little cards here, and I've asked Gary Gnaus and Gary Lindley to be at the back of the church. If you're interested, this is what I'm going to read now. If you're interested in having a copy of that, they've got one of these for you. This was at the end of the devotional by the one whom shall remain nameless, because I don't have his name. But the question is, are you quick to complain? Take this survey. Are most people better off than you? Are you the only one who has to go through what you go through? If you were God, would you make any changes in the circumstances around you? Do you find yourself thinking or saying, Lord, it just isn't fair? You know, one of my favorite R.C. Sproul stories, he tells when he was teaching college, and he was a new teacher, and he was in a Bible class, and he said, okay, here are the rules. There are 3 papers due. Each one is worth a third of your grade. The first one will be due this date. The second one will be due this date. The third one will be due to this date. There will be no extensions. And if you fail to meet the deadline, you'll get a 0 for the project. Everybody agreed to that. First paper comes due, and 3/4 of the class comes in and turns in their paper. The rest are saying, oh, you know, it was Parents' Day, and our parents were here, and I was spending time with my mom and my dad, and I just didn't have time to finish. I can get it to you this afternoon. Is that okay? Sproul thought, and he said, yeah, we'll do that. Oh, and they went out singing his praise. We love you, Prof. Sproul, and so on. Second paper came due. Half the class comes with their papers. The rest said, well, it was homecoming. And we were working on floats, and we had all these projects and decorating, and I can get it to you this afternoon or by tomorrow anyway. Is that okay? And, yeah, we'll do that. Third paper comes due. And he says, Johnson, he said, where's your paper? He said, don't worry about it, Prof. I'll have it to you tomorrow. He said, that's a 0. Johnson said, that's not fair. And he said, oh, it's justice you want. You didn't turn in your first 2 papers either, did you? 0, 0, 0. And you have to ask the question, do I want mercy or do I want justice? Do you find yourself saying or thinking that, Lord, it just isn't fair? Do you seriously believe that you'd be as well off right now or even better off if you'd never come to God? I wouldn't have all these problems if I wouldn't have accepted Jesus as my Savior. Do you find yourself spending more time dwelling on what you're missing rather than what you're receiving? Think of it this way. If there were one sin that you could do without any consequence, what would it be? Trick question, because you can't have a sin without consequences. Do you view life as one long pain to be endured in order to escape the wrath of hell? And do many of your thoughts begin with the words, if only God would? And on the other side of this little handout is this little test. If you have ungrateful tendencies, try this test. First, list every positive quality that you have, okay? What's true about you? I'm a nice person. People like me. I'm good looking. I've got money. All those things that are a positive about you. Write those down. Cross off all those that were given to you by God, produced by God's chosen environment for you, or came because you followed God's principles. Okay, so you've got all your good qualities. Now you've crossed out all those that came from God, came from the environment He put you in, or because you followed His principles. Now, list all your accomplishments. I headed up the PTA and I did the community fund drive and I gave a lot of money to those people that lost their home and so on. Okay. Now, cross off all those things that came with God's help. Without God's wisdom or God's intervention. And that includes any assistance that you got from friends or all your material resources, since those were a blessing from God as well. So you've got those things crossed out, right? After you have all those things added up, tally them up, and the result is probably 0. Which is what your character and your good works really deserve from God. Maybe it's better that I don't get what I deserve. Maybe it's better that I bask in God's blessings. Because when I complain about how He's dealt with me, it will only kindle His anger. Father, forgive me for how I've forgotten your gracious dealings with me in the past, how my mouth can praise you at one time and then criticize you just a few hours later. Father, restore my rightful mind. Allow me to see who you are, what you have provided for me, and act in gratitude towards you. Father, again, As we approach this day of Thanksgiving, we realize that you have had your hand of blessing on this country. We've ignored you. We've flouted your rules, your laws. We've encouraged evil. And we ask that you will bring us to repentance, that we'll see our foolishness. And as the song said, forgive our foolish ways. Reclothe us in our rightful mind, we ask. In the special, precious name of Jesus, amen.